In the criminal trial recorded as GR number 220145, the prosecution and the defense built their cases around the exact same clinical diagnosis: mental retardation. Both the victim and the accused were evaluated by medical professionals and found to have significant intellectual disabilities. For the prosecution, this diagnosis was the definitive proof that the crime of rape occurred. Because the victim lacked the cognitive capacity to comprehend the act, the law dictated she was incapable of giving rational consent. The defense, however, took that same clinical evaluation and inverted it. Using a verified psychometric test that placed the accused mental age at 9, they argued he was completely exempt from criminal liability. This creates what we can call the mental age paradox in Philippine criminal law. A clinical mental age is applied asymmetrically. Its legal weight depends entirely on whether the person standing at the podium is the victim or the accused. The Supreme Court of the Philippines was tasked with untangling this intersection of medicine and jurisprudence to determine how intellectual disability functions in a courtroom. To resolve the paradox, the court had to weigh Article 266A, which defines the lack of consent in rape, against Article 12 and the Juvenile Justice Act, which define the threshold for criminal imputability. This case proves that clinical data does not possess a fixed legal value. The same psychometric result functions as proof of a victim's vulnerability under one statute, while failing to reach the threshold for an accused's impunity under another. Evaluating the victim requires defining how mental retardation negates consent under Article 266A of the Revised Penal Code. Earlier rulings in cases like Castillo and Quintos established a strict separation between intellectual disability and traditional concepts of madness or dementia. An intellectually disabled person is deficient in general mental abilities, but they are not necessarily deprived of reason in the way a clinically insane person might be. This decision tree illustrates how the court applies a mental retardation diagnosis. If a psychometric test explicitly establishes a victim's mental age is below 12 years old, the crime is automatically classified as statutory rape. The victim's chronological adult age becomes legally irrelevant. But medical evaluations do not always provide a precise mental age. When a victim's intellectual disability is listed only under a clinical category like moderate retardation, the court must look at the functional impact of the diagnosis. In this specific case, the medical officers testified that the victim could not intelligibly communicate or exercise rational choice. Without a quantified mental age, the court routes the case through an alternate path, classifying the crime as rape against a woman deprived of reason. The specific penal classification changes depending on the medical paperwork, but the ultimate legal function of the diagnosis remains the same. For a victim, any proven degree of moderate to severe intellectual disability structurally negates the capacity to consent. The prosecution meets its burden simply by proving the severity of the condition. The accused attempted to leverage this exact same logic. He presented a verified psychometric evaluation, establishing that he possessed the mental age of 9-year-old. We can see the defense's strategy on the left side of this diagram. They argued that if a mental age dictates the legal framework for victims, a mental age of 9 should trigger the Juvenile Justice Act for the accused. Under this law, the immaturity defense relies entirely on evaluating whether a minor possessed the ability to discern right from wrong. The defense asked the court to equate mental age with chronological age. This argument found traction in the dissenting opinion of Justice Cagioa, who argued that proving a mental age shifts the legal framework away from the rigid concept of insanity and into the realm of immaturity. The majority decision rejected this symmetry. The court ruled that the juvenile justice framework cannot be applied to adult offenders, regardless of their cognitive development. Instead, the accused must be evaluated strictly under the mental disability exemption of Article 12, Paragraph 1. Article 12 requires a severe standard of proof. To secure an exemption, the defense must prove a complete deprivation of intelligence in committing the act. There is no partial credit for diminished capacity. During the trial, Dr. Gonzalez, the psychiatrist who examined the accused, confirmed a clinical diagnosis of mild mental retardation. Dr. Gonzalez made a precise clinical distinction. He testified that while the accused lacked the capacity to comprehend a complex process like a court trial, he retained the intelligence to navigate daily life and discern right from wrong. The mild diagnosis does not reach the threshold of complete deprivation. Because his cognitive defect did not result in a total absence of the power to discern, the accused failed the Article 12 test for impunity. Why does the Supreme Court refuse to equate a chronological 9-year-old with an adult possessing a 9-year-old mental age? This flowchart maps out the post-conviction remedies for both laws. The separation exists not because of the diagnosis itself, but because of what the state does after the verdict. The Juvenile Justice Act is built on the assumption that minority is a transient developmental phase. The system is designed to correct behavior through restorative justice, diversion programs, and social reintegration. Article 12 operates on a different clinical reality. Imbecility and mental retardation are permanent, irreversible neurological defects. The system addresses them through psychiatric intervention and institutional confinement. Applying juvenile restorative frameworks to permanent adult intellectual disabilities would break both the legal and medical mechanisms designed to handle them. You cannot use a temporary behavioral diversion program to cure an incurable cognitive defect. The law strictly separates immaturity from imbecility because you cannot mandate social rehabilitation for an irreversible neurological condition. In the final verdict of GR No. 220145, the accused's defense of intellectual disability failed to grant him an exemption, resulting in a conviction for rape. The court granted one sole legal concession. Because his mental faculties were demonstrably impaired, his diminished willpower was applied strictly as a mitigating circumstance under Article 13, though it did not reduce the absolute severity of the penalty. The same clinical diagnosis produced two vastly different outcomes in the same courtroom because the law asks two different questions. For the victim, the question is capacity to consent. For the accused, the question is total deprivation of discernment. The ruling establishes that while a clinical mental age measures a person's baseline cognitive capacity, it cannot override the chronological status required to trigger juvenile jurisdiction. Mental aging remains a medical observation, not a statutory substitute for youth. The Philippine Supreme Court demands that the nature of a legal exemption must perfectly align with the nature of the state's systemic remedy. Accountability can be nuanced by medicine, but it is never entirely erased by it.